I called the deputy myself, neighbor. I stood in my own driveway with the recording still warm in my pocket, and I watched two officers walk my daughter out in handcuffs. 1 week before that, she had screamed at me to get out of the house I built. So I left, and I took $11 million with me. I'm Walter Hastings. I'm 66 years old, and I spent 41 years building a chain of grain elevators and feed mills across 3 counties of central Nebraska into something worth more money than most men see in 10 lifetimes. Before I tell you what happened, tell me where you're watching from tonight, neighbor. And if you've ever had a child look you dead in the eye and treat you like a stranger, hit that like button, because this one's for you. I didn't grow up with anything. My father drank away what little we had, and my mother took in laundry until her hands cracked and bled in the winter. I swore I'd never let my own children know that kind of cold. So when my daughter Denise wanted the big house on Cottonwood Ridge, I built it for her and her husband with my own money. No mortgage, no strings, because that's what a father does. That was my mistake, not the giving. The believing that gratitude was owed to me just because I'd earned it the hard way. The night it happened, I was sitting at the head of the same scarred pine table I'd hauled up from Kansas in the bed of a rusted-out pickup back in 1987. My hands were resting on the wood, the same hands that had pulled 40 years of grain dust and diesel grease out from under the nails, no matter how hard I scrubbed. Denise stood across from me, and behind her, arms crossed, stood her husband Perry, wearing a smirk he'd practiced in some mirror I never wanted to know about. "Dad, you need to leave," Denise said. Her voice cracked on the word leave, like she was reaching for authority she didn't actually possess. "Perry's not comfortable with you staying here anymore. You're making things difficult. I need you gone by tomorrow morning." I looked at her hands. Soft, manicured, not a single callus in 38 years of living. Mine looked like a roadmap of every winter I'd spent chaining down grain bins in an ice storm so families 2 counties over could feed their cattle through to spring. I didn't say a word. I'd learned a long time ago that silence unnerves people who are expecting a fight. Perry's fingers drummed against his crossed arms, waiting for me to shout, to beg, to remind them both of every dollar I'd poured into that house, that marriage, that comfortable life. I gave him nothing. I nodded once, stood up slow because my knees don't work like they used to since the accident at the Beatrice Mill in '99, and I walked up those stairs without looking back. I didn't pack the watches or the good boots they'd given me for Christmas, paid for with my own money funneled back to me as gifts. I packed 3 shirts, my shaving kit, and the photograph of my late wife Carol standing in front of the first elevator I ever built with my own 2 hands. That was everything I needed. When I came back down, they were still standing in the kitchen looking confused, like they expected resistance and didn't know what to do with the absence of it. I walked out the front door into the cold Nebraska night, climbed into my old Silverado, the one vehicle in that whole compound that actually belonged to me in spirit, and I drove. Before I turned the key, I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app I'd used since it was just a paper ledger and a handshake. I found the account labeled Prairie Holdings, the one Denise and Perry believed was theirs alone, quietly stocked with $4 million in liquid reserve they thought I didn't monitor anymore. I pulled up the founder's override, the one only I held the keys to. I typed in my code. I pressed execute. $4 million, gone from their reach and locked into a trust only I controlled, before I even left the end of the driveway. I didn't feel triumph. I felt the cold certainty of a surgeon cutting out something that had already gone rotten. I put the truck in gear and drove into town, leaving my daughter and her husband standing in a house they could no longer actually afford, congratulating themselves on a victory that had already turned to ash behind their backs. But to understand why an old man presses a button like that against his own blood, you have to go back 3 months to an ordinary Tuesday afternoon and a lie about a home security system that unraveled everything I thought I knew about my family. 3 months earlier, my life felt as solid as the concrete footings under my Grand Island elevator. I had no reason to think the ground was shifting beneath me. I'd spent the morning walking the scale house at our newest facility, listening to the grain augers hum, the smell of dust and diesel thick in the cold October air. That smell has meant home to me since I was 19 years old, with nothing but a toolbox and a stubborn refusal to stay poor. A delay in the shipment schedule sent me home early. I didn't call ahead. It was my house, built with my money, and I never thought I needed permission to walk through my own front door. I pulled up the gravel drive, the house sitting quiet under the gray sky, and I let myself in through the side entrance near the mudroom. I walked down the hall toward my study, the one room in that whole sprawling house that still felt like mine, full of old ledgers and the oak desk I'd used since the '80s. As I reached for the door, I heard a soft electronic beeping and the low murmur of someone talking. My study door was never supposed to open without me. I pushed the door open a crack. My daughter-in-law wasn't there. It was Perry's sister, Colleen, standing in the middle of my study, holding a small black device up near the doorframe, speaking quietly to someone on speakerphone. She was measuring, marking numbers into a notebook, and running her thumb across a laminated diagram of some kind of medical monitoring system. I pushed the door open the rest of the way. The hinge creaked, and Colleen spun around so fast the device clattered to the floor. Her face went white for half a second before she recovered into a smooth, practiced smile. "Walter, you scared me half to death," she said, bending to retrieve the device. "You're home early. I was just measuring for a new smart thermostat we wanted to surprise you with for your birthday. Save you some money on the heating bill this winter." I looked at the diagram peeking out of her notebook. It wasn't a thermostat schematic. I recognized the shape of it from Carol's last year when the hospice company installed a fall detection monitor over our bed. I said nothing. I thanked her for thinking of me, the way a man thanks a stranger for holding open a door, and I watched her walk quickly down the hall to make a phone call I wasn't meant to overhear. I picked the device up off the floor once she'd gone. I pressed the button. It was a laser rangefinder, and the red dot it threw landed square on the frame of my study's double doors. I punched in the measurement myself, 36 inches exactly, wide enough to roll a hospital bed through without scraping the frame. I didn't sleep that night. 40 years of reading structural blueprints teaches a man to recognize when a foundation is being prepared to carry a weight it was never meant to hold. When morning came, I drove to the office like any other day, because a hunted man who changes his routine tips his hand too early. I sat down at my desk and pulled up the Prairie Holdings account before I looked at anything else. The balance that should have read $4 million even showed a flat zero. My chest went cold. I traced the transaction, wired out at 3 in the morning, in one single transfer, to an account I'd never heard of, called Cornerstone Legacy Trust. My office door opened before I could pick up the phone. Perry walked in holding a coffee mug like he owned the county, wearing a suit that cost more than my first combine. "Morning, Walter," he said, using my first name the way he always did when he wanted to remind me we were equals now, not father and son-in-law. "I see you found the reserve account. Relax. I moved it into a high-yield trust. You always told me dead cash is wasted cash. We're going to clear 11% by spring. You should be thanking me." I sat there and looked at his soft hands wrapped around that mug and thought about the winter of 1994, when my first big customer went bankrupt and left me holding a debt that nearly buried the business before it started. I remembered driving to a pawn shop outside Kearney and sliding Carol's wedding ring across the counter, the ring I'd saved 11 months to buy her, just to make payroll for 6 men who trusted me with their family's groceries. I built that $4 million reserve out of the memory of that ring, so I would never have to make a choice like that again. And my son-in-law had gambled it into the wind without asking me a single question. I didn't scream. I let out a long breath, rubbed my temple, and told him he was probably right, that I was just old-fashioned about money and he should keep me posted on the returns. His smile widened into something triumphant, and he walked out like a man who'd just won a war he didn't know he was fighting. Once he left, I turned toward the credenza to grab my briefcase and noticed something wrong with my personal paper shredder, the one only I had the key to operate. Jammed in the blades was a strip of thick, watermarked paper. Someone had gotten into that room in the dead of night and destroyed something they desperately didn't want me to see. I locked my office door, lowered the blinds, and spent the next 3 hours on my hands and knees, piecing together hundreds of shredded fragments across my desk, like a man doing penance. Piece by piece, a letterhead emerged. Sterling Ridge Neurological Associates. A scheduled evaluation. The stated purpose, printed in bold black letters that hit me like a fist. Comprehensive assessment for early onset cognitive impairment and diminished capacity. Patient name, Walter Hastings. Requesting party and medical proxy, Denise Hastings Cole, my own daughter. She had gone to an expensive private clinic and fed them a fabricated history of confusion and memory loss, all so that a doctor's signature could trigger the succession clause buried in my company bylaws and hand her legal control of everything I'd built. The 4 million was never the target. It was just the fuel for their getaway. The real prize was an empire worth $11 million, and the weapon they were building was a piece of paper with my forged signature already perfect on the bottom line, down to the exact pressure of my pen stroke. I swore on Carol's grave I never signed it. I couldn't confront Denise directly. She was too rehearsed, too practiced in her lies, so I went looking for the weakest link in the chain, the man who'd actually processed that wire transfer. His name was Raymond, and he'd kept my books for 19 years. I found him in the parking garage after 6 o'clock, the way he always left, and I stepped out of the shadows and asked him one simple question. Why did the money move? Raymond's hands shook so badly his keys hit the concrete. He told me Perry had come to him with paperwork claiming it was a tax restructuring I'd already approved, carrying my digital signature and my private clearance code. Legally, Raymond had no grounds to stop it, but Raymond had been suspicious enough to run a diagnostic on the transaction before the servers wiped the logs, and he handed me a small encrypted drive. I want you to know something, Walter, he said. 12 years ago, when my wife needed the surgery insurance wouldn't cover, you wrote me a check out of your own pocket without asking the board. I never forgot that. The IP address on that drive traced straight back to Colleen's personal laptop, sitting in my own guest bedroom. I didn't call the police that night. If I moved too early, Perry would call it an accounting error, and Colleen would call herself a temporary house guest, doing them a favor. I needed them to walk all the way to the end of the plank before I cut the rope. So I went home, and I became the man they needed me to be. I walked into the kitchen, turned on the front burner of the stove, and left it burning with nothing on it. I scattered the mail across the floor with the toe of my boot. When Denise found me standing there, staring blankly at the flame, I let my shoulders slump and my eyes go wide and confused. I called her Carol, my late wife's name, and apologized for forgetting to put the kettle on. She didn't rush to comfort me. She stood very still, and I watched a bright, hungry look cross her face before she turned and started typing a message on her phone. I lay down on the couch afterward and faked a deep sleep, and 10 minutes later I heard her footsteps and then her whispering voice on a call, thinking I couldn't hear a word. Yes, he actually called me Carol tonight, she was saying. The doctor's coming Friday for the in-home evaluation. Once he signs, the company is ours. I spent the rest of that week wiring 3 tiny cameras disguised as phone chargers into my study, my living room, and my kitchen, while Denise was at her Pilates class and Perry was at the office congratulating himself. Then I told them I was driving up to a cabin in the Black Hills for a few days of fishing to clear my foggy head. I watched their faces light up with a joy they thought they were hiding. I didn't go to South Dakota. I parked 2 miles down the highway at a cheap roadside motel and spent the next 3 days watching the live feed on my laptop, surviving on bad coffee, waiting for the trap to spring itself. On Friday afternoon, the camera in my living room caught a man arriving in an expensive suit, carrying a leather case, looking nothing like a doctor who'd come to ask about symptoms. He never asked me a single question about my health because I wasn't there. He opened his briefcase, and Perry slid a thick envelope of cash across my own coffee table. The man counted nothing, pocketed it, and pulled out a pre-typed declaration of incompetence with my name already filled in. He signed it without hesitation and told them, in a voice as flat as a closing door, he's legally a ghost now. I sat in that motel room with my hands shaking, listening to Perry pop the cork on a bottle of my best bourbon, toasting to Cornerstone Legacy Trust and to himself as the new chief executive. And then I heard Denise say the sentence that turned whatever was left of my grief into pure, cold steel. Now that we have full legal control, darling, she said, we don't need to wait for nature to take its course. I already toured that state facility outside of Alliance. We can have him committed by Monday. With the medication protocol I've arranged, he won't remember his own name by spring. I called my attorney, a sharp, unsentimental man named Gerald Pruitt, and told him it was time. 20 years earlier, when I first incorporated the business, Gerald and I had buried a clause deep in the founding charter, a unilateral override that let me freeze and reverse any transfer of company funds if I ever suspected fraud. No board approval required. Perry had faked a signature. He had no idea I still held the detonator. I told Gerald to prepare Perry's termination for gross misconduct, to compile every piece of evidence, the forged medical letter, the IP address, the recorded audio of their plan to have me committed and drugged into oblivion, and to package the whole thing for the district attorney's office and for federal wire fraud investigators. I told him we wouldn't touch a single account until Sunday night. not 1 hour early, because I wanted them to spend the whole weekend drunk on a victory that was already gone. I spent those 2 days watching them pack my belongings into garbage bags on the live feed, watching them measure my study for new furniture, watching them plan a future that no longer existed. When Sunday evening came, I drove my truck back up that gravel driveway, straight toward the ambush I knew was waiting. There was a plain white transport van parked near the porch, 2 men in uniform leaning against it, smoking, waiting for cargo. I let my shoulders sag and my hands tremble as I walked to the door, the way a broken old man would walk, and I stepped inside to find Denise and Perry standing in the entryway in sharp business clothes, 4 garbage bags of my belongings dumped at their feet like trash. "Welcome home, Dad," Perry said, no warmth left in his voice at all. "The doctor came Friday. You've been declared incompetent. I'm your legal conservator now. You don't own anything anymore. Get out of this house." I let that sentence hang in the air for a long moment, and then I straightened my spine, rolled my shoulders back, and let the confusion drain out of my face like water down a sink. I looked him dead in the eye with everything I actually was, 41 years of building something out of nothing, and I watched him take an involuntary step backward. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I picked my duffel bag back up, turned around, and walked out past the 2 confused transport men to my truck. I sat in the cab, pulled out my laptop, and watched on the tracking software as the $4 million sat parked in an offshore account under Colleen's control, completely unaware it was about to be gone. I pressed the key. The numbers dropped from 4 million to 0 in less than a second, rerouted permanently into a trust only I could touch. Monday morning, Perry walked into the Grand Island headquarters wearing a new suit, swiped his executive badge at the private elevator, and got nothing but a harsh red light and a denial tone. My head of security, a retired staff sergeant named Curtis who'd worked for me for 18 years, met him at the elevator bank with a cardboard box holding Perry's paperweight, his pen set, and a photograph of Denise. "Your clearance has been revoked by direct order of the founder," Curtis told him in front of half the building. "You've been terminated for gross financial misconduct, wire fraud, and unauthorized theft of company capital. You have 30 seconds to leave this property before you're escorted out." Perry stood frozen while dozens of employees watched him carried out on his own certainty. He called Colleen's number that afternoon to move the stolen money before the accounts froze completely. It rang through to a disconnected line. He spent the next 2 days hiding in a cheap motel downtown, unable to reach her, unable to reach anyone. By Wednesday, Denise still didn't know how far the ground had fallen out from under her. She drove to an upscale boutique in Omaha and picked out a diamond bracelet worth $9,000. Sliding the corporate black card across the counter with the same confident smile she'd worn the night she threw me out. The card was declined once, then declined again, and on the 3rd try the terminal flashed a message instructing the clerk to confiscate it. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Cole," the manager told her. "Your financial institution has frozen this account." She called the bank in a fury, demanding to know why her card had been humiliatingly seized in public, and the manager on the other end told her, in a voice with no warmth left in it at all, that the corporate accounts had been frozen Monday morning by direct order of the founder, and that her husband had been terminated for documented financial misconduct. He went further. "Because Walter Hastings has removed his name as guarantor on your mortgage, and neither you nor your husband currently show verifiable income, the bank is calling the full balance. You have 30 days to vacate before foreclosure proceedings begin." Denise sat frozen behind the wheel of her car, the phone slipping out of her hand, finally understanding that the coup had failed completely, and that whatever they'd built together was already ash. By Friday, Perry had a desperate idea left. He tried to get the corrupt doctor to sign a second, more damning evaluation, hoping to salvage the conservatorship somehow. His rideshare pulled up outside the clinic to find the parking lot swarmed with unmarked SUVs, federal agents in windbreakers carrying out boxes of seized patient files. He watched, frozen with fear, as 2 agents walked the doctor out in handcuffs, his tie hanging loose, his composure gone entirely. Gerald had delivered the recorded footage of the bribe directly to federal prosecutors 3 days earlier, and the doctor folded the second real pressure hit him, offering up Perry's name to save himself. That Sunday night, I was sitting in a rented penthouse downtown, the city lights spread out below the windows, when I heard pounding at my door. Denise and Perry stood in the hallway, unrecognizable, hollow-eyed, weeping. "Please, Dad," Perry choked out, on his knees on the carpet. Call off the federal agents. We're facing 15 years. We'll sign everything back over. We're family. I didn't raise my voice. I pulled out my phone, opened the audio file, and pressed play. And Denise's own recorded voice filled the hallway, describing exactly how she planned to drug me into forgetting my own name. They both went white and silent, finally understanding that none of this had been a moment of spontaneous anger. It had been a plan, built with the same patience I'd used to build everything else in my life. I built an empire for you, I told them, my voice steady and final. And you tried to bury me alive inside it. You're not my family anymore. You're a bad investment, and I just cut my losses. I stepped back and closed the door. 1 week later, the bank foreclosed on the house on Cottonwood Ridge. Denise and Perry were arrested and released on bail so high it drained what little they had left, sitting now in a cheap motel room on the edge of town, staring at federal indictments for wire fraud and elder abuse, facing years they can't buy their way out of. I went back to the scale house on Friday morning, parked in the open yard instead of my old reserved spot, and pulled my original hard hat down off the shelf in my locker, scratched and faded from 4 decades of Nebraska sun. My employees didn't see a broken old man who needed to be locked away. They saw the man who built this place out of the dirt with his own hands, still standing. A father's legacy was never in the size of the house I built for my children. It was in the respect I earned and the strength I found when the people I loved most were plotting my end. Unconditional love doesn't guarantee loyalty. You can spend 40 years breaking your back to give your children everything, and still raise strangers who see you as an obstacle instead of a father. But age is not weakness, and gray hair is not a failing mind. When someone shows you they value your money more than your life, believe them the first time, and answer with everything you have. Have you ever had to cut someone out of your own family just to protect your peace, neighbor? Tell me your story in the comments below, because I read every single one. If tonight's story meant something to you, hit subscribe and leave a like so I can keep bringing you these stories from people who've lived through the fire and come out standing. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. Stay strong, hold on to what you've built, and I'll see you again soon.